All right, I'll let you proceed, but you wanted to voir dire the witness first?
Sure.
Go ahead, Mr. Conrad.
Dr. Deal.
Yes, sir.
A couple questions for you. You'd agree with me that you don't have, well, first of all, you don't know how much weight was placed on Mr. Ellis's back. Do you agree with me on that?
Not precisely, no, sir.
Not precisely, you don't know how much.
I don't know.
Okay. And you also don't know for how long any amount of weight was placed on Mr. Ellis's back either, correct?
By my review of Officer Rankin's statement, it suggests that he arrived, assisted with the restraints, and then took the place of Officer Burbank holding the pressure on the back. And apart from one attempt at recovery position that was met by some returning struggling, he returned in the prone position until fire arrived. So depending on how long that initial restraint took, and depending on how long exactly that recovery position that was attempted took place, you'd have to know those numbers to know precisely how many minutes he was on his back.
Okay. But you don't know those numbers, right?
I don't know those numbers.
Okay. And in fact, Officer Rankin said that when he placed his weight on him, it was just until other officers could arrive. You remember that?
I remember that's what he said.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do you know when other officers arrived?
I just know from his statement what he says he did. I don't know the exact time other officers arrived.
Okay. And then you know that he was in a recovery position for a period of time as well, right?
The first one.
Sure.
Yes, sir.
Okay. But you don't know for how long, right?
That is correct.
Okay. And then Officer Rankin said that Mr. Ellis started thrashing around again, correct?
That's what he said, yes.
Okay. And then he was placed back in the prone position
Yes, sir.
just to hold him there until fire could get there,
Is this a
correct?
voir dire or cross-examination?
Well, I'm going to the foundation of his testimony.
Not with this last couple of questions. I
Okay.
don't think.
If I'm going too far, Judge, then I'll pull back.
If you have another question that's foundational, I'll permit it, otherwise.
So back to kind of my preliminary question for you, Doctor. You don't know how much weight, correct?
Correct.
You don't know for how long, right?
Not exactly.
Okay. And you also don't know how long he was in the recovery position either.
No, I don't.
Okay. That's it, Judge.
Thank you.
I'm going to maintain my foundation objection.
Not to the question that's been posed, I think. But anyway, I can re-ask it. If you can remember it at this point, Mr. Lee.
Dr. Deal, how did Officer Rankin's position affect Mr. Ellis's ability to breathe?
During the time that Officer Rankin applied pressure to Mr. Ellis's back, it affected it negatively, of course. Yes, it made it much more difficult to ventilate, as I tried to illustrate with the pump handle and the bucket handles and those things.
Although you don't know the precise minutes that Officer Rankin was on top of Mr. Ellis, you do know approximately when Officer Rankin got off of Mr. Ellis, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And when was that?
Upon arrival of fire,
And do you recall what time that was?
34-minute, wait a minute. Yeah, 34 minutes after the hour.
I'm going to object and state facts.
You may cross-examine or you
Dr. Deal, would the spin hood have affected Mr. Ellis's breathing?
It would have added,
Object foundation.
it would have added some degree of difficulty in that the mask did cover the lower face.
Are there any other indications, Doctor, from Mr. Ellis's interactions with officers at the scene that he may have had trouble breathing?
Before encountering
No,
the officers?
during the event.
During the encounter, the evidence for difficulty breathing was comprised of his stating that he was unable to breathe, beginning before Officer Rankine arrived, but continuing after. His behavior, which in this context, having seen people with acute hypoxic respiratory failure, he was behaving as a person would be expected to do, especially with someone impairing their ability to expand their chest. So,
Can you explain that further?
I believe the pressure on the back made it difficult to impossible for those changes that we outlined with the intercostal muscles and the ribs and all that to work.
Doctor, can someone speak and still be unable to breathe properly?
Yeah, as I think I mentioned before, speaking, singing, yelling are all exhalation. You're blowing gas out of your chest past your vocal cords, which vibrate and make noise. So you can speak as long as you've got a reservoir of gas within your chest, and you could speak a number of times because you're going to expel 3 to 4 ounces of air every time you speak a few words like that. And you could do that quite a number of times before you got to a point where you could not refill your lungs and do it some more.
Dr. Gill, what is hypoxia?
Hypoxia is a level of oxygenation in the blood that does not allow for normal cellular respiration. As mentioned previously, glucose is our primary fuel. We require oxygen for the glucose to be metabolized in the normal way and generate energy and carbon dioxide, which is then exhaled through the lungs, typically.
And doctor, have you treated patients who are experiencing hypoxia?
Yes, sir.
What kind of symptoms might be common to see with someone who is experiencing hypoxia?
Well, it's very common to see anxiety or signs of anxiety. Anxiety is what the person is feeling, but signs of anxiety, the patient themselves feels dyspneic or, in English, short of breath. And it's pretty obvious, I think all of us here, looking at someone who was in, moderate hypoxic respiratory failure, you don't require advanced degrees to tell that person is not doing well. They're short of breath.
Doctor, what is air hunger?
Air hunger is another term for shortness of breath or dyspnea. It's the feeling that you can't take a deep breath in.
Doctor, in reviewing the medical evidence and reports from the scene, did you see any evidence that Mr. Ellis was suffering from hypoxia prior to his death?
I did, yes, sir.
What did you see?
The primary things that I saw were the noted heart rates, both by Officer Rankine when he rolled him over upon arrival of fire, and by Paramedic Wilson when he described him as bradycardic, and then ultimately complete loss of cardiac function.
What about agonal breathing? Was there any evidence of agonal breathing?
Judge, I'm going to object at this point, goes beyond prior rulings.
Overruled, you may answer.
Agonal breathing is breathing when you can look at an individual with agonal breathing and tell that they're just about to stop. the most common appearance of agonal breathing that we see is taking slow, exaggerated breaths, which he obviously couldn't do. And what Paramedic Wilson described was not those slow, big breaths, which are, the person's unconscious and they're breathing 2 or 3 times a minute instead of the normal 15 or so. But what was described by Paramedic Wilson was ineffective respirations, which is another way of saying his breathing was so shallow that he couldn't adequately ventilate and oxygenate.
Doctor, what does it mean to place someone in the recovery position?
As I understand it, from this case, because when I place patients in prone position in the hospital, it is not in restraint, it's for totally different reasons. So I understand it to be that the person is rolled over such that there's no pressure on their back and they're laying on one side or the other, what we call right or left decubitus position in medicine.
Can the recovery position be useful to assist someone who is having trouble breathing while restrained?
Yes.
Breathing like
Well,
Restrained.
while under restraint, okay.
How?
well, it takes that pressure, even if there's no weight on the back, but particularly if there's weight on the back, it takes that pressure off of the rib cage, allows the rib cage to expand more fully, takes the abdominal contents off the diaphragm so the diaphragms move more easily, and it can be very effective in recovering someone if they still have normal ventilatory drive and good cardiac function.
Do you know whether Mr. Ellis was ever placed in the recovery position prior to EMS arriving?
Yes, sir.
And why didn't Mr. Ellis recover after being placed in the recovery position?
He did the first time. He was placed in a recovery position. Once again, unclear time frame, how long. By the description, it sounded pretty immediate that he began to behave in a manner that they felt the need to put him back on his stomach. And at some point after that, before the arrival of fire, he relaxed. When fire arrived, they put him in the recovery position then.
And why did he recover after being placed in the recovery then?
Because I think,
Beyond the scope.
Is this an opinion you have more probably than not?
more probably than not, I think at that point, he had been hypoxic.
Just because he says more probably than not doesn't make it true all of a sudden. He's got to lay the foundation for how it's coming.
I'm satisfied with the foundation, so.
More probably than not, he had been hypoxic and acidotic to the point that his heart muscle, the metabolism, we know he had a normally contracting heart just 2 years ago. Your heart muscle requires oxygen and a normal pH environment, which is how acid or alkaline your blood is, to pump properly. And I think by that time, he had gotten to the point, and he was unconscious, and his ventilatory drive was almost certainly not normal, more likely than not. And he was beyond recovery, I think, by simple recovery position.
Are you familiar with the medical interventions that were performed on Mr. Ellis by EMS?
Yes.
And what were they?
When EMS encountered him after taking his restraints and clothing off, they put in an intravenous catheter, which allowed administration of medications. They began pretty immediate bagged mask ventilation with an oral airway in place, which allowed them to help him move gas in and out of his chest. And ultimately, they put an endotracheal tube in his windpipe, which gives you a little more stable way to continue to ventilate the lungs.
Are those respiration-based therapies?
Yes, sir.
Now, if respiration-based therapies, like what you just described, does not resuscitate someone, does that mean they don't have a respiratory problem?
Does that mean they don't or they do?
They don't.
It's not the primary problem. It's the reason he's in the situation, but simply restoring ventilation and oxygenation at a point after he has not had adequate oxygenation for a period of time, at least, 3 minutes-ish, would make it very difficult to recover, even if you had normal lungs. Because you need your blood flow to take the blood past those little capillaries we talked about so they can soak up the oxygen and get rid of the CO2.
Would going back to the illustration help you explain that process?
I'm happy to point to it again.
Can we go back to exhibit 564, please? Dr. Deal with that?
It's already up. So, you recall I talked about the right heart pumping this blood up here, and it goes through the alveolus and soaks up oxygen, excretes carbon dioxide, and returns as oxygenated blood to the left heart where it's pumped out to the body. As his resuscitation continued, he was getting, it sounds like, good ventilation, and I assume oxygenation, even though his sensor never picked it up. But the reason I think the sensor didn't pick it up, is, among other things, is he didn't have enough cardiac perfusion to maintain his breathing, meaning he had to have a certain amount of cardiac perfusion to perfuse his own coronary arteries. And he was at times beating the equivalent of 30 beats a minute, less. And so I think that contributed to his inability to be resuscitated after the paramedics got there.
If I could have one more. Thank you. No further questions.
Yes, Judge, just 1 second. Dr. Beal, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir.
I wanted to get back to a couple of things that you said regarding Mr. Ellis's parts making his ability to breathe more difficult. And as I understand it, you listed the vigorous activity, or strike, he needed more oxygen. It's not his ability to breathe, but he needed more oxygen because of the vigorous activity he was involved with, his use of methamphetamine, and the taser.
Yes, sir.
And we had a chance to speak sometime earlier when we interviewed about specific questions of this case, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you recall us asking questions specifically about the taser and what, if any, effect it would have on his need for additional oxygen.
I apologize, I don't recall that specific questioning.
Sure. That's fine. Let me see if I can help you out. Excuse me, Doctor, 1 second here. We have a place for your transfer, but no transfer. It was marked. 518 is up here already? Oh, here. Dr. Lee Handy was marked as exhibit 518.
Thank you.
You got it. Doctor, if I could have you turn to page 30
30.
Of the interview, and then start at line 22 and go to line 31, line 5.
31, line 5. Yes, sir.
All right, and Doctor, I asked you whether or not the taser would have had any effect on his need for additional oxygen, and we asked you that. Actually, my partner, Mr. Frick, asked you that specific question, did he not?
He asked, what is my opinion as to the cause of death? And I did not think that would, in and of itself, materially cause his death.
Right. In fact, you said it wouldn't even be a contributing factor, correct?
Not to cause his death.
But you told us here this morning that the taser did, in fact, was a cause.
I think to me, the taser is like the mask. It is a possible contributor, but without it, this very same outcome may have occurred.
Okay, so it really has no effect on Mr. Ellis.
It's not certainly a primary cause of any problem.
Fair enough. It's a temporary pain, correct?
Well, it is more than pain in that it does increase your heart rate, increase your blood pressure, make your muscles tighten up to the point that elevated muscle enzymes have been demonstrated in people like that. But I guess what I was saying was a death from a taser strike would typically be, I guess, not unlike methamphetamine, ventricular fibrillation, ventricular tachycardia, but not due to that increased oxygen demand.
He was hit with a taser 3 separate times, correct?
3 separate times, and are we sure there was not a fourth?
Well, we have the jury's heard testimony of 3 separate tasers.
Okay, I'll take 3, yeah,
He was struggling at each and every time after those taser applications, correct?
right.
Right. And then also you indicated that the spit mask, in your opinion, had no contributing factor to Mr. Ellis's situation, correct?
Again, like the taser, if he hadn't had the spit mask, I think the outcome would have been the same.
Okay. The spit mask, do you know whether it was covering his nose?
All I know is that Safariland hood does cover the nose and lower face, as opposed to spit socks, which are completely net.
Did you take a look at the interview or the testimony of the paramedic, the lieutenant, who said that the spit mask was not covering his nose?
I think, I do recall that, I think. Yes, sir.
Now, with respect to the position of Officer Rankin, I want to break this down a little bit. You would agree, would you not, that Mr. Ellis was in an altercation with Officers Burbank and Collins to start out this situation, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. And the officers are attempting to arrest him, correct?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Ellis is resisting their attempts to arrest him.
Yes, sir.
All right. And during that attempt to arrest him, the officers are struggling with Mr. Ellis, correct?
Yes.
And then ultimately, Officers Rankin and Ford arrive at the scene, correct?
Yes, sir.
And they assist Officers Burbank and Collins with that apprehension.
That is correct.
And it is true, is it not, that at the time that Officers Burbank and Collins are with Mr. Ellis, they are grappling with him, correct?
Yes.
They are struggling with him.
Yes, sir.
And they're trying to pin him down to the ground to get his arms behind his back to handcuff him.
Yes, sir.
And during that period of time, both Officer Collins and Officer Burbank are on Mr. Ellis, correct?
Yes, sir.
And Mr. Ellis is bucking them, getting them off of Mr. Ellis, correct?
Yes, at one point, it was described that Officer Collins was thrown off his body.
And in fact, Officer Burbank was down straddled around his buttocks as opposed to about his chest, correct?
I don't remember the term being buttocks as opposed to back, but if
It would make a difference where he was located, would it not?
it would, I don't, the exact language in there, do you remember? I'm sorry.
Well, I'm just asking if that would make a difference depending on his location.
If he was sitting on his buttocks as opposed to his back, it would make some difference, yes.
And you recall Officer Burbank asking for assistance
Oh,
to
yes.
restrain, from asking for assistance to restrain Mr. Ellis.
Oh, yes.
And Officer Burbank assisted him and switched positions with him, correct?
Now, could you restate, please?
Sure.
I'm s-
Officer Burbank is asking for help. He's fatigued,
Oh, yes.
and he's asking for help from his fellow officers, correct?
Yes, sir.
And Officer Burbank then has Officer Rankin come in and take over his position, correct?
That after, as I understand it, Officer Rankin assisted them in the successful application of the hobble.
Well, not to the hobble, just to the handcuffing. Hobbles comes later. The handcuffing, the initial handcuffing.
Okay.
is the first part that is putting Mr.
That-
Ellis under
That
apprehension.
Officer Rankin assisted with, is what
Yes.
you're saying? Sure.
All right, and then after that, Officer Burbank and Officer Collins are no longer on Mr. Ellis.
That is the best of my understanding based on Officer Rankin's testimony.
Okay, if we could turn and publish Exhibit 898, please. Okay, Doctor, you have that there in front of you?
Not yet.
Okay, you will shortly.
Oh, yes. Here it is.
Very good.
Thank you.
All right. And so this is the scene arrival of the various police officers at that scene, okay?
Yes, sir.
And we see that officers Rankin and Ford arrive at 23:24:19 on March 3rd.
Yes, sir.
Officer Lim arrives roughly 25 seconds later, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. And it's once Officer Lim arrives there that Officer Burbank and Officer Collins are no longer on Mr. Ellis.
That is my understanding.
Okay. And just so we're clear, it's at that point in time that Officer Rankin has assumed the position on Mr. Ellis, correct?
That is my understanding based on Officer Rankin's
Very good.
testimony.
And so during this period of time, Mr. Ellis has been struggling with not only Officer Collins and Officer Burbank, but also Officer Rankin and Officer Ford, correct?
Yes, sir.
And then Officer Lim is in there and he grabs Mr. Ellis's legs, correct?
That specific, I don't recall. I'll grant you that happened.
Okay, and so there's 5 police officers that are struggling at that point in time with Mr. Ellis, correct?
Correct.
Was Mr. Ellis hypoxic at that point in time?
I don't think so.
Okay? And then after the time when Officer Lim is there, is at the scene, who's the sergeant responsible for the scene, Officers Burbank and Collins are no longer involved with Mr. Ellis, correct?
That is my understanding.
Okay, all right. And then you've taken us through the balance of the time frame to the best of your ability regarding Mr. Ellis and then eventually fire responding.
Yes, sir.
And also, you testified again about Mr. Ellis making the statements, "I can't breathe,"
Yes, sir.
correct? And he made that over several different points in time.
Yes, sir, he did.
At the time that he said he couldn't breathe was when he's first being apprehended by Officer Burbanks and Collins, correct?
Yes, recalling that there was pressure on his back at one point, even before Officer Rankin arrived, not sufficient to make him severely hypoxic, but I think he was sensing that it's harder to breathe laying on your belly with somebody on your back.
But he's still able to breathe.
Yes, sir.
All right, so these cries out could just simply be a ruse by Mr. Ellis during that point in time, correct?
As the court suggested, it is possible to take it that way, given the outcome.
Well, but
I
the
can't
outcome
say.
is down the line.
I would object and allow the witness to answer the question.
Had you completed your answer, Doctor? Had you completed your answer? You may do so if you.
I was simply going to say, given the outcome that we know and the fact that he had to be truly, really, absolutely short of breath, at least the last few cries, I have no reason to believe he was making it up the first time.
Well, but at the first point, you said he was not hypoxic.
But you don't have to be hypoxic yet to feel short of breath, right?
Well, but there's a difference between being hypoxic and being short of breath, correct?
Yes, sir.
I could go running and I could be short of breath,
Yes, sir.
but I wouldn't necessarily be hypoxic, although.
I hope
I
not.
certainly could be.
Yeah.
I certainly believe I certainly could be.
I don't think you would.
All right, so he is not in a hypoxic state at the time he's initially in a struggle with officers Collins and Burbank,
I don't think so.
okay? And we've agreed that when Officer Lim is there, there's 5 officers trying to still control him, he's not hypoxic.
I don't think, at what point in the struggle he got to the point that his oxygen demands exceeded his supply, I can't say for sure, but I don't think it really occurred until he had sustained pressure over minutes
Okay?
subsequent to that initial.
And this is
Encounter.
less than 1 minute,
Yes,
less than 1 minute that he's in a struggle with Rankin and Ford, Sergeant Lim, Officer Burbank, and Officer Collins.
yes, sir.
All right, so taking your several minutes, he's not in a hypoxic state.
I don't think so.
Okay, and you also testified that even when Officer Rankin had control of him, released him once he calmed down, put him in the recovery stage, he was back and he started struggling again.
Yes, sir.
That would signify to you that he was no longer in his hypoxic state once he started struggling again.
Once he started struggling again, he was recovering. I don't know how complete that recovery was before he was placed back in the prone position.
And you would agree that officers are trained to make the areas safe?
Yes, sir.
And a person who has been apprehended, and handcuffed behind their back, and even hobbled, if they continue to struggle, then it's really not safe for other officers to be there under those circumstances.
I think at the point that he had his hands and feet restrained, turned on his side, and if he began thrashing around, I do not believe he could have injured anybody if they all just formed a big circle around him and stepped back
But he
and let
didn't
him
want to-
tire himself out.
But he didn't want to injure himself. I mean, that's another responsibility of the police officer, not?
It would be a secondary concern. I think public safety would be your first concern. And you've already established that with the restraints, and there's no civilian coming close at that point. And again, I am not in any way speaking as an expert on procedure,
Okay.
okay?
Let me ask you this, Doctor. You said that you reviewed the police reports of, as I understand it, all of the police officers that are on Exhibit 898.
I don't see anybody that I missed.
Okay, so all of those folks are on there, correct?
Yes, sir.
And in particular, I'll hand you a couple more here. Doctor, I hand you this marked as Exhibit 822.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
You can see if you recognize that particular exhibit.
Eight,
822, Judge, yes.
As I mentioned, there were interviews at several levels.
right?
I'm near certain that I read this,
Okay.
but it was one page and a whole pile of stuff.
Totally understand. And this is a report from K.C. Jones, correct?
Yes, sir.
Washington State Patrol. Correct?
That's what it says. Yes, sir.
And he talks about when he arrives at the scene, his observations, correct?
Yes, sir.
And he says that he observed them.
This is hearsay.
Well, as I understand it, this is one of the bits of information the doctor relied on.
Yes.
So, can at least continue with the question, then we'll see what's still objectionable.
Yes, thank you. And, Doctor, it states that in the narrative portion, that the record prepared by Trooper Jones says that I observed a male lying on his stomach detained in handcuffs. Correct?
Yes, sir.
He was screaming and appeared to be striking the pavement with his head.
I see that.
I overheard several officers attempting to speak with and calm him. However, it did not appear to be working as he continued to scream and struggle. Correct?
Yes, sir.
And then he stated that because there were multiple officers on scene, he didn't want to involve himself in the incident or have any contact with the detained male.
Yes, sir. That's what he says.
All right, and so, Doctor, at the Exhibit 898, where does Trooper Jones come into the picture?
Trooper Jones comes in the picture about 2.5 minutes after the arrival of officers Rankine and Ford.
Okay, and that's at 23:26:58.
Correct.
Okay. And these are his observations
At that time.
at that time. Okay, so, okay. Doctor, thank you very much. That's all the questions I have.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Osler?
Good afternoon, Doctor. How are you?
Good afternoon. Thank you.
I'm going to start with, Mr. Liu asked you about your compensation in this case.
Yes, sir.
You actually entered into a contract with the Attorney General's office in this case on January 25th of this year, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And Mr. Liu asked you about your rate of compensation at $550 an hour. That's just your hourly rate, right?
Yes, sir.
You charge $800 an hour for interviews, right?
I did not in this case because I think that fee is specified as depositions, and I didn't see that they were not called depositions, so I did not count that.
Just so we're clear, so when you gave your interviews in this case, it wasn't sworn deposition.
It was not sworn deposition. I assumed I was expected to tell the truth to the best of my ability.
Right, but you didn't charge it the $800 rate?
No, sir.
It wasn't a deposition?
No, sir.
Okay, so that's a separate fee that did not apply?
It is.
Okay. You also are charging $3,600 a day for half a day for trial testimony, right?
I just revised that after 10 or 15 years in April of 22, and I'll defer to you because you've looked at it since I have.
I have.
Okay.
And you charge $7,200 a day for a full day of testimony.
I believe you.
It's in the contract?
Okay.
Okay. If I'm wrong, I'm sure the state will show you that. Okay. How much have you charged total in this case?
Goodness, I think it's between $15,000 and $20,000.
Okay.
Yeah,
Not including trial testimony, right? 'Cause-
not including trial testimony.
Okay, so upwards in, between $25,000 and $30,000 after today, probably.
And it could be even up to 35,
Okay.
because there's some other work that went into preparation prior to trial.
Well, that other work was reviewing Lieutenant Wilson's testimony, right?
Among other things, yeah.
And you reviewed Dr. Mitchell's report, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And you reviewed Dr. Freeman's report,
Yes, sir.
Dr. Waldenerter,
Oh, yes, yes, sir.
Dr. Smock,
Yes, sir.
Dr. Clark.
Yes, sir, both.
And my understanding is that on direct examination, Mr. Liu asked you that your purpose in this was to determine a cause of death, right?
I was, Your Honor, can you help?
Well, Mr. Liu
Well,
asked.
well, hold on a second. Let me excuse the jury first. Would you please excuse us? You're not supposed to. My rulings about what Mr. Lucan asked me about. I do think when we came back and the jury was present, he was asked about this, and he said, I was asked to focus on the events of this case and how Mr. Ellis died. That was an ask of materials he described.
Right, Mr. Liu
But
asked.
how, describe how he died isn't necessarily the same as a cause of death, which I kind of asked him to stay away from. So I put the doctor in an awkward position on how I'm supposed to answer it. Because on one level, as Mr. Ellis. From the conversation that occurred outside the presence of the jury, that he has such an opinion. Mr. Liu didn't go there because he was doing what he was supposed to do. In my opinion. And if he had gone there, I think he would have been crossing what I told him he shouldn't be crossing. So, you say you can reword the question. What are you gonna ask him when the jury gets back?
He was asked to do the same thing that these other 5 doctors were doing, informing their opinions.
Was he asked to do what the other 5 doctors did? Is that what your question is gonna be?
Right. He was asked.
Well, that's the same thing, isn't it? And even then, it's like, you're asking him what other people were told. And it wasn't like he was in the room at the time.
Or you mean what the other doctors were asked to do by?
Yeah, is that what you just said? Weren't you asked to do it to see the other 5 doctors were asked to do?
Every one of the reports that just testified, which indicate that's what they were asked to do.
That's your conclusion. Right. I mean, you can say he reviewed those reports, if that's important to you. But asking the question that way is not right either. So I don't know where you're going next. If you want to ask about, does he have an opinion about Mr. Ellis's cause of death, you want to open that can of worms up after we just spent two-thirds of the morning not going there, well, that's something else. Steve may have an opinion about doing it through you instead of doing it through them under the circumstances, but, so what are you gonna do here?
I guess I'll ask him about hypoxia, Judge.
That you can do. All right, so you're rising, Mr. Conrad, I'm assuming it's to chip in about something.
That I understand the court's ruling as well, because my understanding is that, so the hypoxia that he's indicating, that he's talked about, part of that is based on the fact that he believes that this was a PEA cardiac arrest, or at least initially. That's the mechanism of death, not the cause of death, right? Two separate things.
You love that, don't you? But anyway, go ahead.
I do. Well, it's important because it's essentially allowing him to say, well, I think this is a hypoxia, but never discussing the fact that he feels it's hypoxia because he initially thought this was a PEA cardiac arrest. I mean, that was a huge portion of his report and the premises of his opinion. I'm not going to go into cause of death in terms of he felt that it was restraint positional asphyxia which caused his death, but he thinks that the hypoxia finding is supported by the PEA, and I'm going to get into the fact that the hypoxia finding is not supported by PEA because PEA is not present. That's it. I don't think I'm touching on cause of death at all. I'm just saying, okay, you say it's hypoxia.
I think you're opening that up because now he's entitled to explain it if he wants to. I'm just telling you.
Explain what exactly?
How the whole PEA thing ties into all this stuff. If you're going to ask him about his opinions about PEA and its impact on his opinions, then it's going to open up the whole thing. And if you really want to do that, Mr. Conrad, I'm going to let you do it. But I'm just telling you, that's not what the conversation. I told you this morning you could do it if you want to.
That's fine.
But I also said, well, I didn't say this, but I'm thinking you should be careful what you ask for.
I understand the court's ruling. I think it's important that
He has not expressed an opinion that's supported by PA or not one way or the other.
Well, he said that he believes it's hypoxia.
Well, he described how hypoxia can occur
And
because of the situation here. You guys have suggested that there's not enough information to form an opinion about that because you don't know the weight, you don't know the positioning, you don't know the duration, and so on. You don't never have to get beyond that.
But Judge, what he did testify to is, and Mr. Liu specifically asked, why do you think, what is the evidence that you looked at to support hypoxia? That was the question. And I objected to it as well, I believe. But he testified, well, the evidence that I can point to, the factual or medical evidence that I can point to is the fact that when he went from prone restraint back to recovery restraint, that he had a pulse of 80, but he never really recovered from that, and that it was bradycardia, right? I mean, I have to go into the fact that he's looking at his heart rhythm, but I don't need to go into PEA. I mean, I can just go into the pulse that he's relying upon, or that he had no pulse. But I don't think that the state is essentially, talking about all the facts that he believes support, and then if I come back and I say, well, okay, let's talk about the facts that you think support hypoxia.
Do what you want to do. Do what you want to do. But hypoxia is simply the diminished oxygen content for a sufficient amount of time to cause injury to the person. Is there some evidence to suggest that Mr. Ellis was deprived of oxygen for any length of time whatsoever? Sure. And without doubt. And whether you believe it or not, maybe Mr. Ellis was as I say, feigning the idea that I can't breathe because he was trying to get Rankine and, Burbank and Collins to back off because he's in the middle of a struggle and, you say anything you want to win the case, right? Just like lawyers do. But, and so maybe that was false. And the fact that he's screaming it suggests a certain quantity of air to do that as opposed to some smaller quantity later on. And so maybe there was a, boy who cried wolf quality about this, where maybe he faked it initially, but wasn't faking it. But just because that's one take on the evidence isn't the only take that could be made. The another take is he really couldn't breathe, and that's why he said it. And if he couldn't breathe, then he had a lack of oxygen. If he had a lack of oxygen, hypoxia can happen. And then the question is did it last sufficiently long? And you never have to get into any of the rest of this stuff. If you want to go there, I'll let you go there. But I don't know. What am I missing?
Well, I just think that the state has asked him what evidence supports his finding of hypoxia. And so,
Well, as I say, all that was required is for him to say, I can't breathe. But then you've got the positional stuff that he was talking about. Well, if there's a weight on somebody's back, it's going to be harder to breathe.
and he
And
mentions,
there's evidence of that too.
he also mentions bradycardia, right?
Yeah, there's lots of things that get mentioned.
Okay. Well, so me going into bradycardia doesn't open the door any more than the state has already opened it and already discussed why he thinks there's hypoxia.
Maybe.
Okay.
I guess I have to hear what you say.
All right. Well, okay. Understood.
Okay. So, now, I don't know where we are with you, Mr. Osser. But don't ask that question again unless you really want to go there. Let's have the jury back. Because if you go to there again, the doctor's allowed to answer it. Okay, Mr. Esser, what's your question?
If I understood on both direct and cross by Mr. Kurtzer, it was your finding that Mr. Ellis suffered from hypoxia.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And just to be clear, hypoxia is a lack of oxygen in the organs that can cause the heart to shut down or the brain to die, essentially.
Yes, sir.
Okay. But there's a progression in the body to get to that point. You would agree?
I do agree.
In fact, during our interview, we asked you whether or not there was any evidence that Mr. Ellis showed any signs of hypoxia prior to being hobbled. Do you remember that line of questioning?
I do.
Right? And what you told us was there's no reason to believe he's hypoxic before placed in hobbles. You remember saying that?
Honestly, don't remember, but I'm sure I said it.
Well, you have your transcripts in front of you, don't you?
I will accept it.
Okay.
Is that
You
okay?
agree with that?
Yes, I agree with
Based
that.
on all that you've
That's
reviewed?
what I should have said.
Okay.
Mhm.
That's what you did say on line
Good.
7, so you're right.
Good.
Okay. So now I want to walk through this progression, if I understand it then, because in order for Mr. Ellis to be hypoxic in this circumstance, he had to be restrained with the hobbles first, right?
I cannot speak to how essential the hobbles themselves were in relation to the pressure on the back.
Let me ask it this way.
I can't parse that out.
Ask a better question. You understood the hobbles were applied as Officer Rankin and Ford are there, correct?
Yes, sir.
At that point, it was Officer Collins, Officer Burbank, Officer Rankin, and Officer Ford. Is that right? And
Right.
Maybe Lynn was there at that time too.
Maybe he was. I thought they had accomplished before he got there, but I'm not sure.
Not important to this line of question, but those 4 officers are there, and there was a request for hobbles and application of hobbles, right?
Yes, sir.
And you've told us during the interviews, and you still believe that there was no evidence that Mr. Ellis was hypoxic before that, given his actions with the law enforcement officers.
I don't think there's any evidence to say he was hypoxic
All
before.
right. So then that progress, let's use that as a starting point, okay?
Mhm.
If I understand you, that was the first step in Mr. Ellis becoming hypoxic because the manner is restrained, right?
And almost simultaneously had the pressure applied to try to help subdue him.
Yeah, we're gonna get there in a second, but I just wanna make sure I understand. Okay?
Sure. Yes, sir.
Once the hobbles are applied, your position is that then the next step is someone must apply force downward while he's in the prone position, correct?
I believe so. Yes.
Okay. And in this case, you understood that to be Officer Rankin after the hobbles were applied.
Yes.
And then that downward pressure has to be applied long enough to deprive the rib cage and lungs to expand to get enough oxygen, given the other circumstances that we know occur. Is that right?
I agree.
And at some point, I think you said earlier, maybe 4 minutes later, deprivation of the oxygen with the downward pressure once hobbled could create the hypoxic condition that you believe occurred here.
Yes, sir.
All right, so anywhere between a couple minutes after the downward force, can you give us a more definite time period?
Well, what I recall, and again, a lot of this is from Officer Rankin's statement, that upon their arrival at about 24 after the hour, some 3 minutes after the initial encounter, they set about to help accomplish the restraints. And once so doing, Officer Burbank, who had been applying some pressure, shifted off, and because of his continued activity, if you will, Officer Rankin did apply weight to his back, and did so for, if we give them 2 minutes to place the wrist restraints and the hobbles, if we give them 2 minutes, which I think it would have been quicker than that, but then there were 8 more minutes before fire arrives. At some point in there, he was placed in recovery position and began to behave in a way that they didn't like, so they put him back prone and put pressure back.
We're gonna get there.
Okay.
I wanna walk down that
Okay.
timeline for us, okay? Can we get 898 back up? for permission? Thank you. All right, and so 898 is the timeline that we had to look at before doctor, okay?
Thank you.
And just so we can see, at 23:24:19, Rankin and Ford arrived. That's consistent with their reports and all the information you reviewed, right?
Yes, sir.
And then Sergeant Lynn 25 seconds later.
Yes.
And then two Pierce County Sheriff employees, Tony Massinio and Gary Sanders, within 6 seconds and 15 seconds, essentially.
Yes, sir.
All right. And then Mr. Pertzer had you look at Casey Jones's report. That's at 23:26 hours, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so back to my chronology, okay? So once the hobbles are applied, no indication hypoxia has set in with Mr. Ellis, right?
Not at that moment.
Right, because he's still talking and moving and resisting, right? Got it, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So sometime after 23:24, once he's put back in the prone position and weight has been placed on his back for up to 2, 3, 4 minutes, then he becomes hypoxic. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Okay. And in the timeline, if Casey Jones from the Washington State Patrol, which you just reviewed his report for the jury, says that he's screaming and hitting his head on the concrete, is he hypoxic at that point in time?
I suspect he was
Okay.
agitated, etc. We don't know how much to ascribe to his intoxication and his basic makeup, but at that point he was struggling, and that was 2.5 minutes after the arrival of officers Rankin and Ford.
Okay. You described for Mr. Pertzer that at some point Officer Rankin put Mr. Ellis in the recovery position. Did I have that right?
That is what I read.
And I understood your testimony to be that when he was placed in that recovery position initially, that he was not hypoxic because he was again resisting and doing the things that would be indicative of oxygen.
I do suspect he was getting hypoxic at that time, and I do believe he was recovering as he was placed in the recovery position and began to kind of come around and behave in a way that they felt required them to put pressure on the back again.
And unfortunately, we don't know when in this timeline that occurs, right?
That is true.
But it sounds like what you're telling us is your expert opinion that some act after hobbles but before that put in the recovery position caused him to become hypoxic potentially.
Before the first recovery position,
Yes, sir.
he was somewhat,
Okay.
but to distinguish between that and the last one, he recovered.
Sure. Okay, so, but we don't know what act specifically after the hobbles were placed on before the first recovery was causing that condition. Is that fair?
I'm sorry, could you please restate?
Sure. Can you tell us what the act was that caused him to turn hypoxic sometime after the hobbles were applied, before the first recovery position? Just the downward force?
Just downward force.
Okay, and who did that? Do you know?
I believe it was once the restraints were applied that Officer Burbank shifted off and Officer Rankin stepped in to try to help subdue him.
Okay. But what we do know, and you know, based on your review of all the evidence, Officer Collins had no contact with Mr. Ellis once the hobbles were placed on, right?
I don't know of any contact that he had after that.
And so no act of Officer Collins could have caused the hypoxia, right?
I don't think an action of Officer Collins caused the irreversible hypoxia.
Well, you just indicated that he wasn't hypoxic at the time the hobbles were placed on, right?
Right.
And if he has no contact with him after the hobbles were placed on, then no act he did cause the hypoxia.
I'll give you that, yes.
Okay. One of the other things that you talked to us during both the interview, and I think you testified a little bit about this today, is that the restraint alone doesn't cause hypoxia such that Mr. Ellis would die, right?
Yes, sir. That's been studied a number of times.
Right, I think what you told us was that restraint in the prone position with wrist connected to the hobbles without weight applied would not cause hypoxia.
It would not cause, certainly wouldn't cause severe hypoxia that would affect his other bodily functions.
Okay. And in fact, during our interview, you said there were a number of studies that restraint positioning alone is not in and of itself likely to cause significant hypoxia. Is that right?
That is my understanding.
Okay. And so your opinion in this case is that some act after the hobbles were applied, meaning downward pressure,
Yes, sir.
restricted the rib cage from allowing Mr. Ellis to get sufficient air, thereby putting him in a hypoxia state.
That is what I believe.
Okay. And are you aware that Officer Collins was not even near Mr. Ellis during that time?
Yes, I'm very aware of that.
Right. In fact, he's speaking to Sergeant Lim back by the patrol vehicle, explaining what happened during the time frame that you're saying an act occurred that caused Mr. Ellis to become hypoxia, right?
I don't know where he was standing, but I know he was talking to Officer Lim, and that Officer Lim separated him and Officer Burbank from the situation after he heard the description.
And with respect to Officer Burbank, it's your understanding he's actually in the patrol vehicle waiting to speak to Officer Lim during the time period that you're indicating the acts were perpetrated on Mr. Ellis that caused hypoxia, right?
I did not recall him sitting in the vehicle. I don't contest that he was.
During our interview, do you recall describing the time period in which you thought acts were perpetrated on Mr. Ellis, creating the hypoxia circumstance where after he stopped resisting, they rolled him over and then applied weight after that?
Are we talking about the first recovery position?
We are.
Okay, so he was put in recovery position. He began to, again, behave in a way that they felt needed to change. And so they put him back in the prone position, and I don't think he was returned to recovery until the medics arrived.
Okay. Do you remember telling us that at that point when they put him in the recovery position the first time, that death was not likely if he would remain in that position?
I still believe that, yes.
You believe that after that first recovery position, the return to prone with some sort of weight on his back is what caused him to die at that point?
I do believe that, yes.
And in that point in time, Officer Collins and Officer Burbank are still nowhere near Mr. Ellis, right?
That is correct.
One of the things that I asked you this question during the interview was, if somebody has the ability to talk, to speak, that's indicative of a high level of brain function, correct?
You're not unconscious yet, that's for sure. So
Well, in order to articulate a
to
thought,
make words, you have to be pretty conscious still.
meaning, you were asked about brain death during the interviews as well, right?
Right. Yes, sir.
Because Dr. Clark suggested that maybe there was brain death associated with a lack of oxygen, right?
Yes.
You said that was a very unusual term in this case. Why?
It seemed a little early to apply that term. What he did base it on is the description, again, by, I think, Paramedic Wilson, of pupils being fixed and dilated. And if his pupils were fixed and dilated, and that was despite their resuscitation efforts, he may not be formally brain dead yet, because we have some very strict ways we look at that. But I think he was at a point where recovery was not going to happen unless he received immediate resuscitative help.
All right. Do you remember indicating to us during that interview that if Mr. Ellis was still able to move and resist, there was no reason he would have gone on to stop breathing if no other weight was applied and no downward pressure was applied?
I still believe that to be true.
All right. And I think you said this morning, but with hypoxia, there's no anatomical indication of death, right?
That is correct.
Can you tell the jury what that means?
Well, you know, when someone dies of a gunshot wound or trauma, it's very apparent. A heart attack leaves thrombosis in a coronary artery. Pulmonary emboli, you find clots in the large vessels of the pulmonary arteries. We didn't find any of those specific causes of death, and there are no anatomic findings on the histologic preparations that were applied by Dr. Clark that could show how hypoxic he was or whether he was or not. There's just, you can't demonstrate that on routine slides.
And you'd agree also that there's no anatomy of death in cases where there's sudden death. For instance, are you familiar with excited delirium?
I know that it's not recognized by any reputable medical organization and is a term that is applied less and less now that we have audio and video capture of events.
Sure, but you're a physician, right?
Yes, sir.
You've been trained on, let's call it a constellation of symptomology that has been associated with excited delirium.
We see delirium a lot, but in and of itself, it's absolutely not fatal.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting
Yeah.
that delirium causes death, but there are, for instance, somebody who's suffering from mental health, psychosis, a drug-induced psychosis, is agitated and irritated and aggressive. They can die from that constellation of symptomology. You agree with that?
Not absent something else like hypoxia or acidosis.
Okay. So if Dr. Clark would opine that excited delirium is a medical diagnosis,
You know, see, I was trying to question. Well beyond the scope of the
Complete the question.
if a forensic pathologist agreed that that was a manner or cause of death, sudden death, from that constellation, you would disagree with that?
state objection.
Overruled, you may answer.
I wasn't asked and did not say that I agreed with everything Dr. Clark said on either his first or addendum reports. For instance, I think he said he was in sinus rhythm. We never have any evidence of sinus rhythm in this man.
Right.
So, yeah.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I won't ask you to comment on Dr. Clark, but so you disagree with the proposition that excited delirium can cause sudden death without an anatomy being present.
Well, with one caveat, I mean, if they had demonstrated ventricular fibrillation, ventricular tachycardia, things that could occur due to some hypoxia on top of all the other things, I would not have as easily been able to discount the meth itself, but we never saw a rhythm that was consistent with methamphetamine toxicity.
Doctor, in review of all the reports and witness statements, you're aware that Officer Collins contacted the paramedics upon arrival, aren't you?
Yes, sir.
And that Officer Collins sought them out and told them to hurry up and get to Mr. Ellis because he exhibited signs and symptoms of excited delirium, right?
Are you saying that Officer Collins contacted them before they got him in restraints?
No, maybe it's a bad question. Are you aware that when fire arrived on scene,
Yes, sir.
so they arrived on scene, I think you said 23:34.
34.
Right? that Officer Collins sought out Lieutenant Wilson when he arrived and said, please hurry up and get to Mr. Ellis because he's shown signs and symptoms of excited delirium which can cause sudden death.
I don't recall knowing that. I do know that that paramedic Wilson was told by probably more than one person what had been going on as he was approaching the patient and preparing to assess and render treatment.
Fair enough. You said you reviewed Officer Collins' tape statement, is that right?
I did. Yes, I did.
And the jury heard that yesterday, and you recall hearing him indicate, him being Officer Collins, that he went up to paramedics and said, hurry up and treat him because he's got signs of excited delirium.
I accept that he said that. You know, it was a lot of pages, and I don't recall, but I believe it.
Understood. That's fair.
You know, if we take our afternoon break.
Is it time to break? Okay, we'll take our afternoon recess for 15 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, please do not discuss the case among yourselves with anyone else. Do not permit anyone to discuss the case with you or in your presence. Thank you. This is not a picnic. So, we're back ready for the jury. Okay. Mr. Usher? Okay, Mr. Conrad?
Hello, doctor.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Situated here. All right. So I want to go through a couple of things you mentioned today in direct examination as well as cross-examination. The first being this idea of hypoxia. And so you obviously have discussed hypoxia so far in this case, and you'd agree that there's no anatomical finding that supports that there was hypoxia in this case, right?
Just as there would be no anatomical finding if he had had ventricular fibrillation and died. You don't have an anatomical finding for hypoxia in this case.
Okay. So nothing that you can point to that you can specifically say, hey, look at his oxygen saturation, evidence of hypoxia, right?
I think the progressive bradycardia is strong evidence of progressive hypoxia.
Okay, and I'll get into bradycardia in a second here. But when you're opining on a case like this, when you're providing opinions on a case like this, it's useful if there's something that you can point to in terms of some medical evidence, anatomically, physiologically within his body that you can point to say that's evidence of hypoxia, right?
That would be useful if it existed, yes.
Okay. And in this case, you agree with me that it's not.
That is correct.
Okay. And it's interesting you mentioned that there would be no anatomical evidence of ventricle.
VFib?
Yeah, VFib. Ventricle fibrillation, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And one of the things you mentioned in support of this theory of hypoxia is that you believe that the weight of an officer is important to your analysis, right? To your opinion.
The amount of weight applied to his back is important, to my opinion.
And the information that you're relying upon is the information that's been presented to you by the Attorney General's office, right?
Some of the detailed information I have came from things like Officer Rankin's interviews.
Sure, but all that information was provided originally from the Attorney General's office.
It was, yes, sir.
Okay, I'm trying to take baby steps here.
Yeah.
So, and then, but I mean, some of the information, like the medical records, that was specifically bait stamped with the defense baits on it. I don't know if you noticed that.
I didn't notice, no.
Okay. And you're first contacted in about January of this year for the first time to provide an opinion on this case, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so you're provided a number of statements. Officer Rankin's statement, right?
Yes,
Officer Ford's statement.
yes,
Officer Sergeant Lim's
Yes.
statement and report.
yes, sir.
You relied upon Officer Komorowski. Do you remember him?
I remember the name, yes.
Officer Kate Madden.
Yes,
Okay. Trooper Casey Jones, you talked about already.
yes, sir.
A number of witness officers to this event, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And you'd agree with me that Officer Rankin is not the only one that was involved, obviously, in helping restrain Mr. Ellis, right?
Certainly not initially, and how much others assisted going forward, I can't say.
Okay, well, you reviewed the report of Officer Komorowski, right?
As I said, I know the name, so I know I reviewed it. I would have to be reminded of its content.
Sure. I'm going to hand you what's been marked as Exhibit 702, Joint Opposing Counsel 702. Your Honor, can I approach?
Proceed.
Thank you. So this is Plaintiff's Exhibit 702. Can you take a look at that if you could for a second, Doctor? And
Yes, sir.
just to refresh your recollection, and when you're done, let me know. I want to ask you a couple questions about it. I believe on the back side.
Oh, okay. I was saying,
Sure.
thank you. Okay, I think I've
Okay.
scanned it.
So Officer Komorowski was also involved in helping restrain Mr. Ellis, correct?
He assisted the officer by placing his knees, hands, and body weight on his legs and held his legs there.
Okay. To keep Mr. Ellis from stopping flailing around, right?
Not being there, I don't know, but I assume that was the reason.
Okay. And then, do you remember what Kate Madden wrote in her report?
I remember her making a comment about Officer Rankin, I think, but I don't remember exactly what she said.
Okay. I'm going to show you what's been marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 744.
Thank you.
And I can take that one back. For
Okay.
me. Again, the back
Yeah,
side.
thank you.
Of course. When you're done, I want to ask you a couple questions I could look up.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so Officer Kate Madden also helped assist in restraining Mr. Ellis on that night, right?
I assisted in holding the subject's legs still so he was not able to roll over.
Okay, so that, again, so that Ellis couldn't roll and potentially harm himself, right? Or others, I should say.
Or take a deep breath, but she was holding legs, not torso.
And, I mean, nowhere in there does it indicate, obviously, what Officer Rankin's doing at that point, right?
Not in this report. And I did get that memory from somewhere. I'm not sure whether it might have been in one of the TPD wasn't the only agency that interviewed Officer Madden, I don't think.
Okay. And then,
But, yeah.
so we have Officer Komorowski assisting and restraining Mr. Ellis, right?
Legs, yes, sir.
Okay, sure. Officer Kate Madden assisting,
Legs,
sure. Helping assist in
Yes.
restraining Mr. Ellis.
I agree.
There was, Officer Burbank was obviously helping, restrain him at a certain point as well, right?
He was at a certain point, yes.
Right. Officer Rankin as well, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Sergeant Sanders as well, right?
I don't recall.
Do you remember Sergeant Sanders' interview at all?
I remember the name, but not the details of that interview.
Okay. Do you dispute the fact that he helped restrain Mr. Ellis?
Do you have a similar report?
I didn't have it marked, but I can. I'm sure that we'll have another opportunity to speak. So I'll do that in the interim. And then you obviously
Okay.
looked at Trooper Jones's report as well.
Yes, sir.
And he's indicating that Mr. Ellis is screaming, right?
Yes, he did.
That he's striking the pavement with his head.
He did say that.
And there are multiple officers attempting to speak with him and calm him.
Yes, he said that.
And we obviously know about when Trooper Jones arrived as well.
Yes.
Okay. And then, one of the things I wanted to cover with you as well is the timing between when our client Officer Rankin arrives on scene and when fire arrives. And I believe you said it was about 10 minutes, is that right?
Yes, from 24 minutes after the hour until 34 minutes after the hour. And again, it was 24 and some seconds, 34 and some seconds.
Okay. Can we, and Your Honor, with your permission, can we publish Exhibit 434? It's already been admitted.
This is a photograph, right?
Oh, this is a video. 434 is
Oh,
the video. It's one of the Biden videos.
Gotcha. You may publish it. It's been admitted.
Thank you. Doctor, is that appearing on your screen as well?
Not yet, but it's going to appear, yes. No provided vivid video, 32
Okay. Do you
seconds.
remember this video? Have you seen something like this?
I have.
Okay. And can we scroll to 23, 24, let's say 22, right? That's good. Can you just start it from there, please? And can you pause it? And doctor, do you see that patrol car in the middle of the screen there?
I do.
Okay. And did you see the individual running? from
I
that
did,
patrol
yes,
car? Okay.
yes.
And are you aware that that's Officer Rankine that's running towards the scene there?
I was not aware of that until you brought it up. It does make sense. The timing is perfect.
Well, I mean, can we pull up Exhibit 898? So we were looking at 23:24, and we're at about 38, 39 seconds there, right?
I'm not sure it's on the screen.
Sorry, originally on the video that we were just watching.
Here we go.
Right?
So at 23:24?
It was 23, 24, and 38 seconds.
Okay.
You see our client, Officer Rankine, running from his car. At 38 seconds, that's when he's running from his car. You see that?
Okay.
In the video?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then obviously here it says 23, 24, 19 seconds on this
Okay.
arrival for the CAD report, right?
Yes.
Okay, so this has him arriving a little bit earlier than when you actually see it on the video.
I see what you're saying.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so, and then I'd like to pull up as well as Exhibit 24, published Exhibit 24, Your Honor, with your permission. It's also been admitted.
Sure.
Thank you. And can we scroll to the third page of Exhibit 24? Please. Are you familiar with this report?
It's yet to come up. It'll be here in a second.
Why don't I approach with Exhibit 24, the paper copy of
It's
this
there
book?
now.
Sorry.
There's a little bit of a lag here between
Okay.
the lag getting, he just gets in what's on that screen.
Okay. So, yes, I see that and recognize it as Paramedic Wilson's report prepared more or less immediately after the events.
Okay, and can you flip to page 3 and tell me the time that it says that they're at scene there?
This is on page 3 of 9,
Correct.
and
It says it right. I could help point it out for you here.
thank you. Yeah,
At scene.
23, 33, and
Oh.
09.
Okay. 09 is when engine 10 arrives on scene, correct?
Yes, I was going by the time that they were at patient 2334.
Okay. Well, from the time that my client arrives on scene, right?
Yes?
23:24, let's say 38 seconds,
Okay.
to the time that paramedics arrive at 23:33:09. the math on that. It's about
I haven't written it down, so I can't tell you.
it's about 8 minutes
Okay?
between the
I
time
mean-
that he's running on scene to get there to when paramedics are arriving. Whoa.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I hear what you're saying. Again, I haven't done the math. And I think in my statement, I was telling you that officers ranking in 4 arrived at roughly 24 after the hour plus some seconds, and at the fire arrived at the patient at 34 plus some seconds.
Okay. I guess my question again is, if you look at the time period from when our client, Officer Rankin, first arrived on scene to the time period that Engine 10 first arrives on scene, we're looking at roughly 8 minutes and some odd seconds, right?
Yeah, between 8 and 9 minutes, yes.
Well, it's not 8 and 9 minutes. Let's say it's 8 minutes and I have about 19 seconds.
Okay,
Okay. And in that time period,
Wouldn't that be 31 seconds?
I'm 38.
It'll make you feel any worse, Mr. Conner. Fricky's mouthing that I'm right.
8 minutes, what, 39 seconds?
31.
31 seconds, okay. 8 minutes, 31 seconds.
I apologize. I was hesitant to write on the exhibit.
I
And
had 8 minutes, 28 seconds, but then that was based off of the original arrival time. And then I realized that the video showed that he arrives actually
yeah,
after that. So let's talk about what all happened, right, in that 8 minutes and 31 seconds. So he obviously arrives on scene and sees, trying to assess what's going on, right? He describes that in his statement.
yes,
Okay.
he does.
And then he discusses the, that they're trying to figure out what's happening, and that he sees that Officer Burbank gets bucked off at a certain point. Remember that?
Honestly, I thought that was Officer Collins, but the altercation between Burbank Collins and Mr. Ellis was ongoing.
Okay. And so, obviously, we don't know how long that took at that point, right? And then we know that when Officer Burbank gets bucked off of him, you thought it was Officer Collins originally?
I did, but in any event, my impression from reading the statement was that this was happening just seconds before he arrived to assist with restraint.
Okay. And then after Officer Burbank gets bucked off, that's when our client goes to ensure that Mr. Ellis is not going to get up at that point, right?
Yes, sir.
You remember he also had noticed that there was a gun magazine laying there as well.
I remember there being mention of one of the officers' magazines that had fallen out.
Well, he found that out later, right? At the time that he's there, he sees these officers struggling with this individual, right?
Yes,
Correct?
yes,
Okay. He's heard mic clicks on the radio, correct?
yes,
Okay. He's heard an officer yell out, an officer that had trained him, right? Yell out 96 in Ainsworth, and that was it.
mm-hmm,
Right?
yes,
He gets on scene, he sees, two officers in a struggle with this individual, and he's trying to help them at that point,
Right.
And Officer Ford's there as well, right?
Yes, sir.
And you've read Officer Ford's statement.
I did.
And Officer Ford says, I'm holding on to one of Ellis's legs for dear life.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't he say that?
Yes.
And he says Ellis is kicking them around, right?
Yes.
He says Ellis is doing the wiggle worm on the ground with all four of them, dragging them on the ground at that point, right?
Yes.
That's what he says.
Yes.
And then Sergeant Lim, you remember what Sergeant Lim says in his report? You relied upon it.
Yeah.
He says he arrives on scene.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And he sees these four officers trying to restrain Ellis, and that Ellis almost gets up off the ground. Remember that?
Yes.
Okay. And so at this point, you have four officers trying to restrain Mr. Ellis. Mr. Ellis is almost getting off the ground. And so my client says in that moment in time, that's when he jumps on him to make sure that he's not going to get up, right?
Yes.
And then in his statement, he says specifically, this is before Lim arrives, before Sanders arrives, before Massanio arrives. The four of them are there with Ellis. And he says, I remember we just sat there until other officers could get there, right?
I must say, my impression was that between the four of them, especially with the arrival and assistance of Officer Rankine, they were able to get him restrained.
They put him in handcuffs, right?
Yeah. Yes.
They get him in handcuffs. But there's no hobbles on at that point, right? With the four of them there.
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'm going to show you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 65A. Let me ask you, do you want to refresh your recollection as to what Officer Rankine said?
That would be helpful.
Okay. So I'm going to show you what's marked as Exhibit 65A.
I'll swap with you.
Sure.
Thank you.
And could you turn to page 13?
Yes, sir. Page 13.
And so Officer Rankine's describing this moment where he's distributing his weight, all of his body weight, across the torso of Mr. Ellis, right? During this period of time.
Yes.
Okay. And then on page 13 through 24, sorry, page 13 lines 24 through 25.
Page
Page 13 lines
24 through 25. Okay. Yes, sir.
And in there, Officer Rankine says, I remember we just sat there until other officers could arrive, right?
I actually don't see that he explicitly talks about sitting there until other officers arrive. He does go on to describe his saying he couldn't breathe and noting that it was in a somewhat non-distressed voice.
Correct. That when he said, he acknowledged, I heard him say I can't breathe,
Yeah.
but he said it in a calm voice, right?
That's
And
what
he
he-
felt that was weird, that he said it in this calm voice. And
Yes.
then when he's talking about that, he says, I remember we just sat there until other officers could get there,
Okay. Yes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And then at that point, when other officers get there, they assist with placing hobbles on Mr. Ellis, right?
Yes.
Okay. If I could take this one.
Okay.
And the calm voice, right, that our client talks about Mr. Ellis saying, I couldn't breathe in a calm voice. He's not the only one who said that as well, right? Remember Officer Ford's statement?
He's not the only one who said that. Yes.
Okay. Officer Ford, who's his partner, also said, I remember hearing him say I couldn't breathe, but it was weird because it was in this calm voice that he said.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Isn't that what Officer Ford said?
Yes.
Okay. In his statement. And so if we could pull up Exhibit 898.
Did you say 8, 9, 8?
Yeah. It's for illustrative purposes. Sorry, Judge.
This is our
Yes.
timeline information.
I get rolling and then I forget.
I just didn't realize.
Sorry.
At least I want to make sure I'm hearing you correctly.
Sure. So we know Sergeant Lim arrives at 23, 24, 44 according to the CAT, right?
Yes.
So roughly 25 seconds or so after Rankin and Ford first arrived.
Yes.
So it's obviously a very dynamic situation, a lot going on.
Sure.
Okay. And so we know that Massenio and Sanders arrived shortly after that as well, right?
Yes.
And then we know when other officers arrived that a hobble was placed on Mr. Ellis at that point.
Yes.
Okay. And then at that point, Officer Rankin describes in his statement placing Mr. Ellis onto his side, right?
I don't remember immediate placement on the side. I do remember that he assisted in restraining him.
Okay. Well, you do remember that Officer Rankin said that they then put him on his side to do a weapons frisk. Remember that?
I remember the weapons frisk, yes.
Okay. And Officer Ford, do you remember Officer Ford's statement? Would it help you refresh your recollection to review Officer Ford's statement?
Always, yes.
So I'm going to hand you with Motions Exhibit 756. And this is Officer Ford's statement.
Yes, sir. 756.
Yes, sir. And if you could flip to page 4, the bottom of page 4.
Okay. The bottom of the fourth page, Bates stamp 911. Yes?
Okay. And if you could
Is that correct? I just want to make sure.
Correct.
Oh, yeah, it does say page 4 up at the top. Sorry.
Okay. And it's
I just want to make sure I was on the right.
It's the answer to this last question here. What Officer Ford is describing
Okay.
Mr. Ellis and what they're doing.
Yes.
Okay. And take a second to review that because I want to ask you some questions about it.
Yes.
Okay. So Officer Ford describes also speaking with Mr. Ellis, right?
Yes.
He's saying, hey, remain calm. You just need to remain calm. He's telling him over again, stay calm, stay calm.
Yep.
He says that he didn't appear to have labored breathing at that point, right?
Yes.
And he says that he does remember that he said that I couldn't breathe, right?
Yes.
And he said that it was weird also because he said it in a remarkably calm fashion.
He did say that.
And then he says, shortly after that, we rolled him into the recovered position. Remember that?
So he was at least prone and restrained as he was saying he couldn't breathe. Okay.
And then he's rolled into the recovered position.
Shortly after that or shortly before?
So shortly after that.
I thought you said
No. Shortly after that. He rolled him into the recovered position.
That is correct.
Okay. So based on Officer Ford's statement, right?
Yes.
He says that they didn't take some long period of time between him saying I couldn't breathe and wait. They rolled him in the recovered position shortly after. That's what he said. Timing, we're not totally sure. Fair enough?
What I'm trying to determine here is whether this was the first or second recovery position,
Well, we'll get there.
because I don't see that he resumed activity after that.
Okay.
Okay.
So we know then, right, that he's in the recovered position at least at this point.
as fire was arriving, yes.
Well, we're not talking about fire arriving yet. He's just been hobbled. He said that he couldn't breathe, and he's rolled into the recovery position.
Right,
Okay. And then Officer Ford's continuing to talk with him, right?
yes.
Okay. And doctor, if you're done, when you're done reviewing it, I'd ask that you just look up so that we can
Okay,
have a conversation. So we know that while he's in the recovery position at that point, they do a weapons frisk on him, right?
okay,
Remember
Yes.
that? They also, Officer Rankine goes to take out the probes as well. Remember his statement on that?
I remember him checking the pulse about that time, but yeah,
Okay.
he pulled out one of those and put the taser probes in a plastic bag.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well, and we're talking about, I know you have Officer Ford's statement in front
this
of you,
is Ford, yeah,
But you've seen Officer Rankine's statement as well.
I have.
And if you need to look at it again, I'm happy to show it to you.
This is okay.
Just let me know. So they do a weapons frisk, they check for probes, right? Officer Rankine discusses the fact that he was hot to touch as well. He had to remove his gloves. Remember that?
I do recall that statement, which, recalling that 40 minutes after he was 97.6 or something like that. Axillary.
You're jumping way ahead of me, doctor.
Okay.
I'm asking about in this moment in time, what they're doing while he's in that
This guy
recovery.
perceived him as hot,
Okay.
yes.
So he's, and Officer Rankine as well perceived him as hot and sweaty. Remember that?
Sweaty for sure,
Okay.
yeah.
And he even discusses the fact that his gloves seem to be soaking wet from Mr. Ellis. Remember that?
I do remember that statement.
Okay. I mean, those gloves were taken into evidence as well. And that he puts on his medic gloves, and that's when he starts to take out the probes and whatnot. Right?
Okay,
And then
Yes.
we know that there's other officers on scene at this point, at least on scene at this point, with multiple TPD officers, Pierce County deputies, and at some point, obviously, Washington State Patrol.
yes, sir.
Okay. And we know that, well, what we don't know is how long all that took while he was in the recovery position, right? Taking the probes out, changing his gloves, doing the weapons frisk, talking to him during that period of time, right?
Well, he describes at the somewhere near the top of page 5 that when he looked at him after rolling him over, he wasn't looking at me, he was kind of looking through me. And from that point forward, he was unresponsive, I believe.
This is Officer Ford.
Ford, yes.
But you don't know specifically when he's talking about. It's not clear the timeline based on his statement.
Okay.
You agree with me on that?
I have to, yes.
Okay. I mean, you'd agree with me, obviously, you know that there's weight on Mr. Ellis for a period of time, but we don't know specifically how long those periods of time are, right?
That is correct,
Okay.
yes.
And we also know he's in the recovery position for a period of time, right?
Yes,
And we don't know specifically down to the minute or even down to the second when he's in recovery position.
and now we're talking about the first one from which he began to recover.
Correct.
Okay,
It goes weight on his back, waiting for other officers to arrive, right?
yep,
Other officers arrive, then hobbling, right?
yes,
Then into the recovery position, then I can't breathe at some point, then into the recovery position,
yes,
you with me? Then probes, removal of the probes, then we have changing his gloves, doing the weapons frisk, and then at a certain point, he starts thrashing around again, right?
After Ford is there, having him look through him, I don't think his recovery was after that. No. No. What he's describing here is that second episode of attempted recovery position, which worked because he was unconscious.
Officer Ford is discussing placing him in the recovery position and talking to him at that point, right?
He was doing that earlier, trying to de-escalate,
Sure.
and he was doing that earlier, but he doesn't.
He doesn't say that they put him back in a prone position.
Ask that the witness be allowed to finish his answer.
Did you complete your answer, Doctor?
Sorry, sir. Ask your question again.
Okay. So, in Officer Ford's statement, he describes rolling him into the recovery position, correct?
Yes,
Okay. And he doesn't describe putting him back into the prone position after that, right?
because this was the second time.
Where does he state that in his report, that it's the
I
second time?
don't know. This is the time from which he did not recover.
Well, doctor, he never says that in his report, right? He never says he goes back into the prone position after he's in the recovery position for the first time. Officer Ford does not state that, right?
I don't see him stating that.
Okay.
Sorry.
So let's stick with what the officers actually state in there, because what he states is he's in the recovery position, and then he starts speaking with him immediately, right after that, after they do the weapons frisk, after they do this, and at that point he says he's got this 1,000-yard stare to him. That's what he's describing in there.
Before he recovered partially.
He's only describing putting him in the recovery position once. Remember that?
That's all I see here.
Okay. And he never describes putting him back onto his belly at that point when he's looking at him and he has this 1,000-yard stare.
No, he does not describe putting him back over at that time. This had to be, according to Officer Rankine's statement, this had to be the second time he was put in recovery position.
And, well, you're saying that Officer Rankine stated that that was the second time?
He's not time synced with Officer Ford's statement. I'm simply saying that there was one attempt to place him in recovery position. He partially recovered, manifested by activity that they were concerned about enough to resume the prone position. It was only when it was only when fire was on approach on the ground that he was put in this position and had the look described by Officer Ford.
Okay. I mean, Officer Rankine does not describe that at that point, right? Ever seen that?
He does not. He was not looking him in the eye. Yeah.
You're right.
Right.
Officer Ford is sitting there talking with him and looking in his eyes.
He's looking in his eyes, but the talking had been earlier when he was trying to de-escalate, I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he describes that when he first got there to assist.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's fair to say you're surmising that the time that he's talking about this 1,000-yard stare had to have been the second recovery position that he put him in? Is that your statement?
Since he does not describe him recovering consciousness thereafter, and he says in the very next answer that fire arrives and takes over.
Okay.
Page 5 of 14, the bottom answer is what I'm referring to.
Okay. But he doesn't give a time for when.
He does not.
Because essentially what he's saying is recovered position at that point after I can't breathe. He's continuing to monitor him, and when he sees that he has this 1,000 minutes spare.
What he doesn't capture in this statement, and he was there, was the first attempt to roll him to his side, because this is clearly the second attempt. Because after the first attempt, if we take Officer Rankine's statement, after the first attempt, he began to recover and had to be put back in the prone position. And this occurred just as fire was arriving.
Well,
But I do not have a timestamp on that.
okay. Well, you do. We just looked at when fire was arriving, right?
Well, yes, I know. "34 some odd minutes after the hour."
So, I want to talk to you about a couple other things. Well, let's just clean this all up in one last go at it. The evidence that you're relying upon in terms of weighted restraint on his back, you know that it took place initially until other officers arrived, right?
Yes,
You know that he's then placed in the recovered position, but you don't know for how long.
the first time. Yes, sir.
Okay. You know the first time. And then you know that there was something going on with Mr. Ellis. He's thrashing around, that he's placed back into the prone.
Yes, sir.
And then Officer Rankine describes putting just enough pressure on him to hold him there, right? That's what he says.
I don't know how much pressure he was applying.
Okay. He doesn't describe distributing his weight evenly across his back when they put him back into the prone, right?
I don't recall. There's no way for me to know how much weight was being applied.
Exactly. You don't know.
That is true.
Okay. And then you also know that he's put back into the recovery position at some point again.
And my understanding from reading everything was that was virtually happening simultaneously with fire, the engine arriving, and maybe as they were running toward the scene or proceeding toward the scene.
And we also know that during this 8 minutes and 31 seconds, there's also multiple other officers assisting and restraining during that period of time, right? We just went through it. Komorowski,
Yes.
Madden, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't dispute that Sanders also helped restrain at that point.
That was in the first minute after they arrived.
And
Yeah.
we know that Casey Jones is also talking about this individual, Mr. Ellis, thrashing around.
Yes.
Okay. The other thing I wanted to discuss with you is, again, related to the facts that you relied upon. One of the facts that you also relied upon in determining hypoxia was the fact that initially you felt, or your understanding was that there was no pulse. Mr. Ellis had no pulse upon arrival of the emergency medical staff.
And what I understood from the initial information I had, which included that one strip that was with Lieutenant Wilson's report, since he said that he was bradycardic, which is defined by less than 60 beats a minute, if we take that strip, it's about a 6-second strip. If we look at the first half of it, the electrical impulses are, way apart, consistent with, say, 30 beats a minute. If we look at the second half of that, we see several impulses that are closer together, consistent with about 100, 110 beats a minute, or electrical signals a minute, and yet he described him as bradycardic. I took that to mean that he could not feel pulses from those more tightly grouped electrical signals. Does that make sense?
Sure. Well, that's not exactly my question. My
Okay.
question was,
Sorry.
when you initially formed your opinion in this case, it was one of the facts that you relied upon was that Mr. Ellis did not have a pulse when the fire department arrived. Is that correct?
His pulse was described as thready and faint.
Okay. I'm gonna hand you what's been marked as
We're
exhibit.
gonna- 4
And-
minutes after 4, so we'll take our break for the day. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be recessed until tomorrow morning. Please do not discuss the case among yourselves with anyone else. Do not permit anyone to discuss case